Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for attending this evening. This is going to be a really nice conversation between Negar Ahkami and Donna Honarpisheh. I will go ahead and introduce both of the speakers, and then after that, we'll go ahead and begin the conversation with a short slide presentation that will familiarize you with the show Le Caftan, Le Turban by Negar Ahkami. The conversation should go on for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for Q&A. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A, and I'll make sure to address them at our 40 to 45 minute time frame. So I'll go ahead and read the bios for this evening, and then we'll get started. First, Donna Honarpisheh. Donna Honarpisheh is the curator for the Night Art and Research Center at the Institute of Contemporary Art Miami, where she develops pedagogical and digital initiatives at the intersection of critical theory, the global South, and contemporary art. In addition to her curatorial practice, Donna is a PhD candidate in the Department of Comparative Literature and the program in critical theory at UC Berkeley. She's writing a dissertation entitled Disordering Modernism, Aesthetics of Affiliation in 20th Century Iran, which discusses a modernist occupation with psychic affiliation across Iranian literature, film, and painting in the wake of the US and British imposed coup d'etat of 1953. She has experience teaching undergraduate courses at UC Berkeley in film, literature, and critical theory. Her writing can be found in Simploque, Qui Parle, Critical Times, Iranimag Journal of Iranian Studies, Jadila, and the University of London Journal of Islamic Shia Studies. Welcome, Donna. And now Negar Ahkami. Negar Ahkami, who is a resident artist at AAC, holds a BA from Columbia University and an MFA from School of Visual Arts. She's an alumna of Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture and Lower Manhattan Cultural Council's Workspace Residency. Ahkami has exhibited at the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, the North Carolina Museum of Art, the Walters Art Museum, Rutgers University, the Bronx Museum of Art, Leila Heller Gallery, and Rossi and Rossi Gallery. Her work is in the collections of the New British Museum of American Art, DePaul University Art Museum, Wellington Management Company, the Mohammed Ahkami Collection, and the Farjam Collection. Welcome, Negar. So as I mentioned, we'll go ahead and have this discussion. I want to also say that if you haven't had a chance to come and see Le Caftan, Le Turban, please do come to Arlington Art Center and see the show in person. The works absolutely beg to be seen live and in the flesh. They're really ornate and textured, as I'm sure we will see this evening. The exhibition will be open from Wednesday through Sunday, noon to 5 p.m. All right, and with that, I'll go ahead and give it to you, Negar and Donna. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and to Katie as well. I'm going to share the screen and show you some images from the show, and then we'll try to do this as quickly as possible so that Donna and I can have a nice conversation. Thank you for that wonderful pronunciation of Le Caftan, Le Turban from Amanda. It's a sort of kind of playful way of being both French and exotic, referencing caftans and turbans. When you enter the exhibition there through the stairway, or you could also enter on the opposite end through an elevator, you come upon a sort of reclining, cartoony version of Catherine Deneuve, an odalisque kind of representation, and you see this painting on a gray wall, and on the interior, you notice that there's a different wall color, kind of warmer color. On the other side of that gray wall are self-portraits, kind of miniature in scale, in the style of Matisse, which are meant to be really much in contrast with the paintings alongside of it on either wall. On one wall, you have film icons, mostly Sophia Loren, but then another Catherine Deneuve, European film icons who in their heyday in the 60s did wear caftans and turbans at various points. And on the opposing wall are some paintings of fashion models, fashion muses from the 60s and present day, who sort of embodied this kind of sex, drugs, and rock and roll kind of dangerous beauty mystique, and wearing a caftan was kind of part of that. image. And in terms of scrolling and looking at individual works, that first painting that I showed of the reclining Deneuve, what you don't see is there's a lot of texture. These are just iPhone sort of detail shots where you see there, you might detect that there's some bas relief textures, some glitter on the left and in the sky, and gold. It is very visually dynamic when you see it in person. Depending on where you stand, it kind of changes and different things catch your eye. There's little details of the three kings, the three magi, kind of offering things to Catherine Deneuve, offering ceramics, gold, frankincense, myrrh. And then the other representation of Catherine Deneuve is probably more my style, this sort of like vortex of pattern, swirling kind of composition. This is loosely based on a picture of Catherine Deneuve in a caftan, in a Yves Saint Laurent caftan. And again, what you're missing from this and from not seeing it in person is the texture. I mean, her face is very sort of ceramic looking with bas relief textures. There's the three kings, there's gold and glitter and pearlescent, very dynamic. The three kings are kind of all over this composition in roundels, praising her, and sort of quasi-religious kind of halo. In the Sophia Loren paintings, I'm more looking at Italian ceramics and how that sort of merges with Islamic art and ceramic traditions from Iran, as well as from Turkey. And you have these textures again that are kind of visceral when you go up close, but as you sort of step behind, it seems more exquisite. But up close, there's a little bit of, you know, viscerality and rawness to the texture, as well as the glitter and gloss and dynamism. And this small painting is just 9 inches, and I kind of think of it as really referencing Turkish ceramics, as well as Italian Maholica, Maiolica, Deruta, Faenza traditions, and it really has an object-like feel with a bas relief kind of face. And then this kind of takes a step further in texture. The textures are quite crude, and it's referencing ceramics, Italian pottery, ancient Greek pottery, specifically ancient Greek pottery that looked to the ancient Near East, motifs such as the rosettes and palmettes, and incorporated that into ancient Greek art via the pottery. And the specific reference in this painting is Sophia Loren played the part of a sort of vixen, of an Arab, Middle Eastern vixen, in a movie called Arabesque, which was kind of fabulous, but also highly problematic with all sorts of stereotypes of Middle Easterners. In one scene, she wears this incredibly flamboyant caftan with like a veil, or and it's this is a sort of representation of that on my own sort of terms, without being hyper realist, but it matches the level of flamboyance of this Yves Saint Laurent designed caftan in the film. And then you have the sort of fashion models. This is based on a socialite named Talitha Getty, who was kind of an it girl in the 60s, who came into the fashion world's consciousness for looking amazing in a caftan in Marrakesh. And you have this kind of Orientalist blend of references of Moroccan caftan sort of around her neck, but then also Persian textiles and architecture. And her face is quite enamely looking in person. There's just crazy textures and movement in this painting in person. I'm sorry that you can't see it, for those who can't see it. And this is a small painting of Talitha Getty, where the poppy patterns in her caftan, these Persian poppy patterns in the textiles kind of echo the sort of poppies and the sort of opium kind of that was in the ether, the heroin that was in the ether of this era, and certainly this kind of aesthetic of a heroin chic, I guess, that even was true in the 90s of models. And then you have this sort of it girl ideal, kind of very deathly looking. If you look at these are both the same painting, but different conditions of light. On the left, you sort of see the glitter, the gold and the glitter on the bottom half of the painting. And then on the right, you kind of see how jaggedy her face is. It's like really almost aggressive kind of texture, jewel-like, but also kind of visceral at the same time. And unfortunately, this is not the best image, but this is of the Kate Moss representation, a more modern day it girl who also embodied that sort of rock and roll image and looked hot in a caftan. And then, these paintings of fanciful sort of pattern and ornate sort of surroundings are really in contrast with the gray wall that has the self-portraits. And these, as I said, self-portraits are based on actual Matisse paintings. And I'm not, these specific paintings are paintings of the model Laurette, who was, I think, Southern Italian and just had very bold features. And I have this very asymmetric face with a nose that definitely has certain angles that are more prominent than others. And in these portraits, I'm definitely playing up the worst angle. I mean, or the most, where the nose appears the most broken and the biggest and the most ethnic. So there's definitely something quite personal in these photos, and they're meant to be in contrast with the other sort of European wearers of caftans and turbans. And I think we'll end there. I will stop sharing, but we could always go back to images at any point. Stop share.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing those, Negar. Thank you, Catherine and Amanda, for the introduction. I'm just so happy to be here to talk with you about your new exhibition. So this feels like such a great chance to continue a conversation that we've been having, that we started almost 10 years ago, about another exhibition of yours. And I guess I want to start there because there's a lot of similar, for people who might not be familiar with your entire corpus, there's a lot of familiar imagery and interests in kind of these Persian images and motifs and styles. And there are definitely subjects at the center of your previous work, but the subjects seem to kind of take a different centrality in these newer images. And I want to think a little bit about what making these icons as the painting's focal point is doing. There's an immense amount of detail that surrounds them, and you're still playing with themes of consumption and kind of being engulfed in these different textures and fabrics. But I'm wondering what these icons are doing for you in this iteration of your work.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I've been for a very long time, since the 90s, even, just obsessed with Orientalist imagery and how and not so much in this didactic way that has to do with the book Orientalism. Certainly that is part of it and in my consciousness, but really as an artist, about just from an experiential level, about sort of, accumulating a lifetime of images in pop culture and in art history where there's an intersection between the Middle East, and specifically for me, my obsession is definitely around Iran, but just the way Iran has been lumped together with the larger Islamic world, and being sensitive to that, and just being, just as an Iranian American, being hypersensitive to perceptions and misperceptions and that lumping. And just there was something so accessible about, not just white women in caftans, but white sort of European icons, really just recognizable people. And I think the first sort of woman in caftan painting I did was much more fanciful and was a woman from my own imagination. I do love to work from my imagination. But I think that while that painting drew people in with texture and color, I don't think the content really was clear. And there was something more, a way to draw people in through the recognizable characters. But even Talitha Getty, though, for example, she's not necessarily recognizable to people. She's more of an obscure fashion world reference. But even that, though, the representation of her as this sort of icon, the quasi-religious kind of icon, is a way at getting specifically at the way in which the culture, the Western culture, American culture, pop culture worships, the wearer of the caftan, which is really for me a metaphor of so many things that happen in the culture at large, in art history. The way in which we worship and draw our spotlight and halo, or whatever you want to call it, around this notion of the one genius, the maven, the person who owns this look, who owns this, this decoration and pattern because they claimed it and they look amazing in it, or they did it some sort of twist with it. But all the focus and attention comes on that sort of wearer, as opposed to the centuries and millennia of traditions that existed well before and that continue to be relevant in those places that are just utterly devalued, on a daily basis. And so this is a way for me to just kind of playfully get at this sort of maddening phenomenon that I find in things that just genuinely inspire me. I'm like at once inspired and kind of like maddened by it, by this devaluation on the one hand, and like praise of the genius that discovered this thing, whatever it is. So
yeah, I mean, one thing that's so I think significant about this body of work is that you're also kind of thinking about different aesthetic registers. There's fashion and textile and materiality there, but there's also cinema and these popular cultural icons. And then there's, the fine arts. And these are all these kinds of art historical narratives, some of them more popular than others, but in which there's a canon, and sometimes the influence gets kind of totally erased from that historical narrative. And so you're really kind of reinserting the icon and all of the culture of consumption around it back into the source material.
Oh, wow. You said that so well. Thank you for getting it, because there's just, to me, I see it as all related, this complexity. And, I am this voracious consumer of visual images, right? We all are. We're in a media saturated world, right? An image, especially now more than ever. But throughout my lifetime, images were so central to me in terms of deeply felt. And I was such an avid consumer of pop culture, as I was a museum goer, a gallery goer, obsessed with the art world, even as a teenager. And so for me, it's all on an equal playing field. There isn't that hierarchy. And it's just the reverberations of the same thing that you see over and over again. It's on a daily basis, whether you're on a design blog or reading a magazine. Well, people don't read as many magazines these days. We're looking at, I'm very old fashioned. I like magazines, the tactile sort of experience, flipping through something. It's just, it's all very present for me. And this vortex that you referred to, this like consumption, this like being consumed by pattern, this being like completely overwhelmed in a way by this very bold and in your face like pattern that almost competes with the image sometimes, is it's kind of an emotional language that gets at both this like whirlwind of inspiration. When I'm inspired by the ornament and Persian art, I'm literally like, it's this visceral experience that is incredible, and it's dizzying and maddening and enthralling in this beautiful way that makes you feel like alive, like you're, on a dance floor or something. It's just this very dizzying experience for me. But there's also something in that language of pattern, the complexity of pattern that conveys this maddening quality of like frustration with these things that never seem to resolve itself, that always, there's never enough acknowledgement. There's always a feeling of erasure, of like it's never sufficient. And so yeah, that's all.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm wondering if we can go back to Le Kaftan after Donna and just take a look at that painting.
Yeah, share
I was really struck by the ceramic looking face that you pointed out.
Oh yeah, sorry. Then a little glitchy on this. Okay, let me just so yeah, this is a detail, right? With just an iPhone, pardon my poor photography, but just to give you a sense of how ceramic looking it can be, there's just lots of glazes and bas relief. Her nose is quite like perfect little point, and it's kind of bas relief little point that it really is pronounced when you see it in person. And her lips even, it's hard to tell that in this larger image, but in the larger image, of course, you get a sense of the composition.
Yeah. Well, I just love that because there's the icon, especially with somebody like Catherine Deneuve, who is really recognizable. And then the hardening effect of the ceramic. Like what were you thinking there in terms of kind of sedimenting her face in this way through the
Well,
actual material of the painting?
I think just for a long time, and I think people who haven't been able to see my work in person for the last, for the last 2 decades that I've been working, I have been working in this way where the paint kind of looks like ceramics. And that has been very exciting to me because that is really such a primary influence on me. I love, and yet I've never made ceramics myself. I really never done it. I've never, from start to finish, I've never done that. And I don't have the desire. I love painting. I like the layering of paint. I like the immediacy of painting. But the ceramic traditions that I love the most are definitely Iranian. Like I'm just genuinely in love with Iran's incredible ceramic traditions. And I see the connections in global ceramic traditions, and they do exist. There is an art historical basis for connection to Chinese blue and white ceramics and Iran's tradition, right? The cobalt came from Iran, right? The Iran and Iraqis were the first market for blue and white ceramics. There was, already this very like ornamental taste, right? In the culture, so rooted in Iran. In the development of that language, and then French porcelain, Delft, all of these things. The Persian part of it, the Middle Eastern, the ancient Near Eastern part of it seems to get kind of subsumed, right, or buried, forgotten. And I think there's just in ceramics, there's just an inherent globalism, right? Speaking to so many cultures, right? I love that. While I'm thinking of the tiles of Iranian mosques in this painting, I mean, a friend who saw the show recently pointed out the relationship to the Star of David in those stars that also exist in Persian mosque tiles. That there's a globalism. There's many religions within Iran that were completely relevant. There's a globalism that exists in this language. These little fragments of ceramics have traveled to the West and have, its influence lingered, in Mahalika and all of these. And so really it has to do with both just aesthetically, just loving the tactility of ceramics, but also the content of it, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just looking at this image again. I love the way that there is the central icon of Deneuve, but it also, the spiraling out means that it's drawing our eye. It moves our eye around the painting. So you're always kind of pulled into paying attention to maybe parts of the canvas that a portrait might not draw your attention to.
Oh, I love that you say that, because that is my most, like, I don't really care about virtuosity. I never did. I feel like I make paintings on the terms of what I think is good. And what I love most about my Persian influences is the way my eye travels. And it's to me, that's ecstatic. Like I said, it's like I feel like a whirling dervish looking at a Persian miniature even, or a rug, or the ceramics, especially the architecture that's completely covered in the most incredible ceramics, the patterns, the intricate patterns with all that texture. And so the way your eye moves is what I what I want in most of my paintings. And some of these paintings are less like this. Like this is more my comfort zone, my aesthetic kind of language, I would say. But you're right in that, you know, this is a very unusual body of work because I don't make portraits. Like I'm not an artist that considers myself, I don't consider myself an artist that makes portraits. And yet in this painting of, you know, this is not my typical composition at all. Like I would normally do this again. And I do want to do this subject again in a more sort of, you know, eye travel kind of composition. But there was a specific intent with this painting, which was very much like to capture this moment of this, you know, to capture this image and to wrestle with it of Sophia Loren, you know, in this getup, like brown face getup, essentially, and it, you know, and just the you know, this guilty pleasure that I have in this kind of movie, and in Sophia, who's just so beautiful and fun to paint. But also just the crudeness of the texture. I mean, you know, to me, it's like, you know, brown face is kind of crude. Why should it be perfect? Why should the art be perfect? And so again, there's this kind of chafing against virtuosity. There isn't as much eye travel in this, although I'd like to think that in person you would look at the little rosettes and the little sort of moments around her. But she's clearly central in this for sure. Should I stop share, or do you want to look at more images?
Maybe. Yeah, I mean, maybe we can think a little bit more with one of the paintings that has that kind of accumulation of texture, whichever you prefer.
Maybe this one, which unfortunately you can't tell as much, but there's a lot of texture happening in the embroidery of her caftan, on the flower sort of imagery.
And I just want to draw everyone's attention to the fact that these are really kind of textured images. And if you could speak to, you know, why it was important to use this kind of additive effect for these works in particular.
Yeah, well, then I'll cut to this one. This is the jaggedy texture, right? So again, this like chafing against perfection, like I'm not sanding everything to perfection so that it's perfectly smooth. I mean, there was a time where I experimented with that, and I really like the humility of something that's imperfect. And then the layering and layering, somehow like making it, somehow the end result ends up being this weird tension between, you know, ugly and beautiful, like exquisite and totally crude or unrefined. Like it's both of those things at once is the sweet spot. And it's, unfortunately, you almost really need to see the work in person to really get at the exquisite stuff. Like some of these pictures show the crudeness more, or the reverse. You might not see the crudeness as much as you do in person. But it's a very psychological thing for me, which I think goes back to this duality in everything that I paint. Whatever my imagery is, there's always this like this aspect where I'm so inspired by the art historical conversation, the pop cultural conversation. Like it gives me genuine inspiration and desire to have like a visual dialogue with it. But then there's a frustration, you know, and it usually relates to the stuff that I've been, you know, working through for the last 20 years. And so texture is a way of dealing with that, but then also just like going back again to the tactility of ceramics and just being so inspired by that, like in Iranian ceramics, you have bas-relief ceramics, right? And a lot of the tiles and bowls even, and I love that sort of bas-relief ceramic, but the variation in textures is also something that's true when you're in like a Persian architectural space that has lots of tiles, and then you have matte areas and shiny areas and kind of rough hewn kind of areas where something's falling down and there's brickwork. So that variation just inherently really excites me, in addition to the tactility.
Yeah, I see that, the way that, if you're actually in a bazaar or a mosque or something, things are fragmented, they're chipping off, or there's some plaster in an area trying to put it together, and you get that feeling in these images, I think, where where there's these kind of accumulation of, and the fact that there might be something historic and beautiful, but just kind of sitting next to, because it's something that's in use when you encounter it and the kind of everyday use of it in Iran, for instance, it might be next to something totally different. So I feel like your images also bring that conjunction of images that you might encounter together.
Yeah, I mean, you're lucky you've been there kind of recently, probably, right? And
A couple of years ago, yeah.
I mean, for me, I almost feel like I can't access these spaces anymore. And so it's like a portal for me, right? It's like, even though it's very much on my own terms and I'm not trying to mimic the mastery of Persian art by no means, but it is like this portal, this way for me to totally engage in that experience that I love. And that, again, just going to Esfahan and seeing the mosques, it's just,
it's an all-consuming experience. It's a kind of ecstatic experience there, and I love the way that you bring in both that kind of, there's maybe a mystical ecstatic experience, and then there's the kind of the sea of poppies and the Orientalist depiction of Easterners as, on hashish, and the kind of enshrouded in dust and smoke, but then also the way that that's also part of 90s fashion culture in a way, that together, or 70s psychedelic culture, and bringing these seemingly oppositional depictions together.
Well, I kind of I've always sort of thought of Orientalism as like a continuing phenomenon, right? It's not just, Iranian artists could be Orientalist in the way that they're like exotifying where they're from, or just like, misleading the audience that their work is intended for into thinking that this is the reality with a capital T or R. And I think I've always just been drawn to these Orientalist sort of Yves Saint Laurent opium ads, or just all the just fashion spreads where there's sort of hearkening to Orientalism. It's problematic, but it's also really seductive. I mean, I think it does have its appeal, and I think there's a part, and that's what makes it so interesting, and I need to go there all the time, I guess, because I think I live in that space of intersection, right? I'm not in one camp or another. I really relate to these areas of the Venn diagram, like, coming together, and Orientalist art, and it is an example of that, right? And so there is, but there is satire in the work. There's irreverence. There's definitely I don't know if critique is the word, because I'm not necessarily trying to manipulate a specific response in the viewer, but there's definitely a response in me that's like, this is problematic, that I think that it maybe shows in the intensity of the work, or the.
Well, I think, it definitely provokes a kind of a critical response, in the sense that I don't think one can see these images or icons and then take them as a given anymore. I think it kind of alters our vision and our fields of perception in a way that, it challenges the way that we see them and take them in. Like kaftans are just so kind of prevalent in fashion now. It's totally kind of dislocated from where they came from. And this recenters that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't intending for somebody to say like 2020 is the year of the caftan. I mean, I've been doing this for a couple of years now. Like there have been caftan images for a while, but I did want to shift it to someone recognizable, or like the icon, that the phenomenon that you mentioned. Because I don't want to call this out and cancel people's ability to wear caftans. I mean, I feel like people should wear what they want to wear. I wanted it to be more about the way in which the culture values, one wearer over another, like values to me, that just goes back to even just like Matisse's mining of Persian art. Like I love Matisse, but I do feel like art history seems to gloss over or erase or not to totally disregard or minimize the impact that Persian art did have on him. I mean, I really do believe that it did. And I've read enough little footnotes here and there, but they're always footnotes or little notes. And it was very visible to me, even as a teenager, seeing his work in this immersive way. And just this notion of like Western artists discovering, just making pattern and decoration relevant. This is even, it was even true from when I was starting out with my very pattern Persian maximalist art in the art world. Like I had a studio visit with an artist who's very successful, who said that, it's because of us that you can paint pattern. And I literally was, I've been reeling about that ever since. Because it's like, wow, you really think that the art world is the reason why I can paint pattern? Like this is, discounting all the Iranian artists that I grew up knowing, and this highly, just so yeah, it's about the valuation, which is, again, goes back to the recognizable person, and why I don't try to point the finger at everybody wearing a caftan.
Yeah, no, I think it's doing it's doing a lot more than that. And it allows us to think about these erasures or absences in art historical canon formation that we might not even consider because it's pop culture or in the fashion world. But those are also part of how we think about, inspiration and where materials come from, and they're also part of that conversation.
Yeah, and like, textiles. I mean, the caftan itself, I mean, I don't want to upset people about this, but even just looking at Google or whatever, like I'm not a historian, I'm not a fashion historian, but I think the caftan itself, although it came into consciousness from North Africa, which is fabulous, and I'm dying to go there myself. And, I don't mean to erase North Africans' amazing contributions. I mean, all those psychedelic sort of fashion references, Yves Saint Laurent, and very much tied to North Africa. But there is an erasure also in the caftan's history, older history, tied to Mesopotamia, tied to the Persian kings. It's very old tradition, and similarly with paisley. Like there's, paisley, the word, why do we even call it paisley? That's the whatever Scottish or British word for something that was discovered in India, but also had roots, very old roots in Iran. And it's it's just this valuation issue, and who gets the credit, who gets to own this stuff, that should belong to everybody. And it wouldn't be an issue at all if there weren't such a wall around Iran and this repetitive lumping, and just the extent to which that civilization is really rich. We're just talking art historically, but really doesn't get the same kind of credit that other cultures have gotten. And I'm a lover of all cultures. I love Italy. I love France. I'm dying to just travel the world. I'm dying to go to India. It's just, there's something about Iran that really gets like erased. I noticed that. I know I'm hypersensitive to that. And I bet maybe someone from Syria would say the same. about Syrian art, and maybe someone from Turkey might say the same, but I really think that geopolitics doesn't help, and the fact that people can't travel there. So
yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think the isolation has kind of maintained this veil of mystery, or this kind of also this just exclusion from certain conversations because of ongoing political situations.
yeah, and ultimately, just to make the final point, I mean, that's the emotional center of my need to make art, is this need to show connectivity and where there's been separation, and there's a real infinite sadness about that. And I think there's a sense of humor in my work and all that, but it's really just this desire to like reinsert connection where there hasn't been enough. So maybe
Thank
that's
you.
a good time
Yeah,
to.
thank you so much. I think that might be a good time to conclude our conversation and start the Q&A.
Thank you, Donna.
Thank you both. This was wonderful. I'll go ahead and first start out with a really nice message that came through the chat from Girasol O'Neill, who said these pieces feel like dreams. They're breathtaking. Very nice. And then actually, Negar, I hope that you'll feel okay about this, but there's a question that relates to some other slides that I know are lurking in your presentation.
Oh, no.
But let me go ahead and ask the question. This comes from Madeline Stratton. Hi, Madeline. She says, thank you so much for sharing your beautiful work. Are the patterns you use taken from specific references, or are they more of your interpretations of Middle Eastern motifs?
It is both, and it depends on the paintings. So I suppose, so should I share screen and show some images, some examples?
That could be
Will
really
that help?
nice.
Okay, so it's both. Usually it's much more open-ended in my work, where they'll have sources that I'm thinking of, but it's really like on my own terms. But there are a few paintings where I did pull things almost like art historically, like pulling things deliberately as a very conceptual kind of exercise for the intention of the painting. And I'll try to do this seamlessly. Let's see. These are the icons. But the lounging Catherine Deneuve, the one where she's an odalisque lying down and it's less dizzying, I pulled from like the fabric and the sky. I pulled deliberately from things that I've seen in the Louvre, mostly from Iran ceramics, as well as from Iraq in terms of the caftan pattern, the palmette sort of pattern on her caftan. And I could go back to that image at some point, but I did this deliberately because I know that Matisse went to the Louvre often, and he looked at the Islamic art, and he loved Iranian ceramics. And I know he looked at that art, and I just thought to myself, in seeing a lot of the work in that collection, like I know Matisse saw this. And so I wanted to sort of upend the notion of what's French, right? What is so French about the odalisque that Matisse painted, including in the patterning in those paintings. And then even just like the Three Kings imageries, like here you have a reliquary, and I didn't copy any of that, but it's sort of the motifs also, and the rosettes on that reliquary on the left, they are sort of in that painting as well. And I could go back to it just so you can see, sorry of all this. So like the fabric on the fabric that she's lying down on is kind of pulled from the vase. And there was also a bowl that was similar. And then that sort of lapis lazuli bit, diamonds in the sky are pulled from those tiles. And then the rosettes, the motifs around her sort of lapel, I guess you would call that, are pulled from sort of French reliquaries that are those rosette patterns and palmette patterns that again were introduced in the lexicon in ancient Greece from the ancient Near East. I'm sure Egypt as well as Iraq, Babylon, and or the Assyrians. And so, yeah, but others, like this is definitely more from my imagination, but really inspired by Persian mosque tiles, as well as, French porcelain from the 1700s in terms of the pink and gold. So does that give you a little taste? Did I answer your question? I could probably go on and on, but that would.
We will let Madeline let us know.
Okay.
Here's another very specific question for you. This is coming from Michelle Coburn. I have a question about the Kruder paintings where you discuss the rawness or the roughness and the sweet spot between perfection and rawness. Did I see Farsi text incorporated into a surrounding pattern? And if so, what does it say?
I'm sorry, which paintings did she say? Which specific paintings?
She calls them the Kruder paintings.
The crude, the sort of yeah. This is quite crude, I guess I would call it, the it girl. I mean, I kind of love her, but she does kind of look like a cadaver. And there is an Omar Khayyam poem that's upside down in this poem. That's upside down, and I don't speak fluent Persian. I mean, I did study in school, but it is a sort of poem about sort of a beautiful person who's also a little lost. I'd have to like literally like, you know, translate it. I couldn't read that for you. It's also upside down. And then in this Kate Moss painting that, again, I wish you could see this in person. It's definitely better in person, but the cigarette smoke has the Persian word for obsession, vasvase. And so I kind of love the way that word looks. It kind of is smoke-like, curly Q. So yeah, playing on this Kate Moss reference to Calvin Klein Obsession perfume, which is, you know, when she came on as this tiny little waif, you know, she was, you know, marketing this Calvin Klein perfume Obsession, just the way the culture is obsessed, you know, just this. And I think I'm a little satirical in these paintings of these women. Maybe it seems unkind, but I'd like to think I have some sympathy just as a woman, feeling some sympathy for these women that are just like so commodified for being like dangerous beauties and, you know, for living like these, you know, encouraged to live these really unhealthy lifestyles. Yeah, I mean, I think that's just the going back to what Donna was saying about consumerism and consumption, like the ways in which the images that we consume can consume us, right? And can make us turn in against ourselves as women, especially.
That's great. I have a couple more questions. Do you like me to go ahead with what I'm seeing here? Okay. Let's see. I have another one from Girasol actually, where she asks, the gazes of your portraits are often looking straight ahead or at the viewer, and it feels like it amplifies the intensity of your patterns. Was this the intent?
Oh, no, not really. I think, but maybe I feel like the gaze like at the viewer is a like confident sort of owning in some of those, like, and in some of these paintings, like of Talitha Getty with the cacophonous pattern and Deneuve with the cacophonous pattern, I kind of feel like they're owning what they're wearing, right? Like, I own this look, you know? And so there's something about that look of owning and feeling confident, competing with this battling pattern that's like, wait a minute, but this has existed all along and this is really intense and like, look here and like what, you know, and so, but it's very psychological. I don't want to emphasize that. I would need to emphasize that more, that I might sound very didactic, very like, and then there's this, and then there's this, and then like a very, I am intentional, but it's ultimately very intuitive, a lot of what I make. And it comes from an emotional response to things that I'm constantly seeing and feeling. So I don't always know why I'm making things the way I make them. They kind of reveal themselves over time. Even the desire to paint Deneuve and Sophia Loren came before I even knew that they wore turbans and caftans. I just really wanted to paint them. And I just thought they would look fabulous in it. And then there was a way at sort of getting at Italian art history and a way at getting at French art history in these faces, in these types of faces. And then of course, Google searches away, like show you actual pictures. And then that led me to this actual film, like oh, it's going to be backwards. Arabesque. Sorry, I don't know how to make it not backwards, but
Oh, we see it fine. Don't worry.
okay, you do. So anyway, so
I've got two more sort of related questions, I think, here about porcelain. Alice Whelan asked specifically if there is any images of the French porcelain in pink and yellow. But before we cut to that, Matthew Landsberg also asked, can you talk a little more about the actual process of creating the work? How do you paint with ceramics? I feel like these are
okay,
related.
well, Alice, maybe I'll get to your image later after, but I don't really have a quintessential image. It's like I did pull an image on there, but it's not necessarily one that I looked at faithfully at all. It was more like going to the Met, I internalized these porcelains and thought like, wow, these are really Orientalist to me. And in fact, there's this Disney show that's fantastic at the Met right now, but it's more about the connection between Walt Disney and these porcelains. And I saw that in the years that I've been passing through those shows, I saw that connection to Disney, but I also saw a connection to Orientalism. And of course, China is a big part of that, but I also saw India and Persia, and I see that in Baroque language. So I didn't look to something faithfully, but the pinks and the golds were very much inspired by that. But in terms of, I'm sorry, could you read Matthew's question again? I know it has to do with ceramics in my process.
Sure. No problem. Let me just pull it up one more time. Okay. Can you talk a little more about the actual process for creating the work? How do you, quote, paint with ceramics, end quote? What is the process for working in so many layers? Since I'm not a painter, I'm just curious to know what's involved. Thank you.
Well, it's probably hurt my career because the work is time consuming, but it's really just a lot of layering. I love painting on these wood panels, and because they're like object-like and they kind of have 3-inch sides, and you could really, because they're panels and not canvas, you could really build up the surfaces. And I basically start most of my paintings maybe with like a little doodle that's like, it would be incomprehensible to most people, but it's really about attacking the surface and feeling it, and then building up the layers with gesso mostly, sometimes acrylic mediums, but it's mostly gesso, and building it up to the way I think of not only Iranian ceramics that have bas relief, but I also think of like the ancient rock reliefs, and even like the Ishtar Gate, and has these like relief-like kind of terracotta lions. Like, so I'm not thinking of like Greco-Roman incredibly exquisite like reliefs. Like I'm thinking more like these ancient sort of reliefs that are almost like cookie molds. and so, but yeah, there's that part of it is like the initial part of the way I work, and then comes the color, and then comes the pattern. It is a labored process, but I tend to work on more than one thing at once, and so I'd like to be at different stages of completion, and just feel like I'm really in the moment when I'm working on things, so that it feels just like there's a need, there's an urge, and a genuine authentic need. But yeah, it does take a long time, but I do love working with the texture, and it started as an accident, really, like that whole evolution in my work, like just like, wow, this really looks like ceramics, and then it's built from there. I don't know if that answers the question. Oh no, I don't hear you. Oh,
We've got, okay, so one more
Okay.
question, and
Okay.
then I don't know if there's any last points that you would like to finish this out with. Actually, I have a pseudo question myself, but let's go ahead and get Marcia's first. We've talked so much about your use of different mediums. Why styrofoam for your self-portraits?
Oh, that's a
And
great
to
question.
be honest with you, I was actually hoping that we could talk a little more about the self-portraits also. So I don't know if you could talk a little more about the difference perhaps between the icons and then the way that you've depicted yourself.
Yeah, okay. But first I'll mention the styrofoam because there's two points in that. One is that I have been painting on styrofoam since the early 2000s. I was able to find like, wow, these are like tiles. And I've been making paintings that are tile-like and in conversation with Iranian mosque tiles and ceramic tiles. And yet bits of styrofoam fragments, like they really look like tiles. And so I found that very exciting. And it started with objects that I bought, like literally bought styrofoam. And then I was like, soon after that, I was like, this is ridiculous. I shouldn't ever buy styrofoam. It's everywhere in New York City, like people with their trash out, or, you know, if someone sends you a gift. So I would hoard sort of styrofoam for a long time and use them eventually in works. But in terms of, these are specific shapes. I mean, they're like tray shapes. And they are Persian cucumber packaging, and some of them are baby zucchini, like the small zucchini, but mostly Persian cucumber packaging. And of course, I identify with the Persian cucumbers. I mean, it's like Persian cucumbers are a real thing. Like Donna can attest. Like this is, you know, we grew up eating them. They're every part of Iranian hospitality. Every Iranian home like has them out in big fruit bowls for people to enjoy. It's been a thing forever. And so it was exciting when those became on the market and they acknowledged them as Persian cucumbers. I mean, how desperate am I and starved for any acknowledgement of Persian things that I get excited in Trader Joe's, you know, that's pathetic. But I have to say that the trays, like I resisted painting on them for a long time, even though it was so obvious, like that they're styrofoam, they're Persian cucumbers. But I resisted painting on them because like Tommy Lanigan Schmidt is the most incredible artist, who's a wonderful person in my life as well when I was starting out. His work on lasagna trays is so iconic and beautiful and ornate and like reliquary objects, really. And so eventually I was just like, I have to paint on these, and this is my nod to Tommy Lanigan Schmidt that I'm doing something with my little corner of Persian cucumber trays, but Tommy Lanigan Schmidt is a god who does amazing things with lasagna trays. So there's my nod to Tommy there. But yeah, I mean, you know, there's something about doing self-portraiture on these really minimal small objects that are discarded kind of refuse. You know, there's something psychological about that. It's not, I would never want to paint me on the big scale. There's no way. Not this nose either. Like I don't want to see it at large. And so yeah, it's easier for me to be able to do it on that scale. And it's like, think of it as like, oh, it's only trash anyway. It's only like, it's very self-deprecating. There was a really great article in the Times last weekend about Jewish humor and the self-deprecating sort of humor in pop culture, and just how dark that is, like how you know, just the not forgetting, like just the problem with that as well, you know, especially in a climate where there really is darkness. And so my work, I think, and sensibility is a little self-deprecating for sure, which can unsettle some people, especially very proud people who don't want to be seen in a self-deprecating way. So it's easier for me to do that in self-portraiture because I'm not deprecating others. I think in the past, I may have offended people with the self-deprecating kind of satire that was outside of me. And so it's easier to do that in the self-portraiture realm, but there is a darkness to it. I don't know if that answers your question, Amanda, but I'm sensitive to the time. It's 7.
Yeah, we're right at 7 o'clock. So I don't know if there's any concluding remarks that either of you might like to make. Thank you so much for this discussion. I've seen some mentions in the chat of how much people enjoyed this. So thank you both.
Thank you. I'm so grateful. Thanks to everybody who's on. I can't see you, but I'm really grateful for people wanted to come. And Donna, you're amazing. And Amanda, you're really amazing too. And I'm just grateful. Thank you for this opportunity.
Yes, Donna, thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for inviting me to be in conversation about these works. It was a pleasure. I'm excited to be in more conversations with you.
Yay.